natives fighting back and demanding voice. As Australia votes, Indigenous people press call for inclusion in Constitution. Reading this article spoke to me. I'm Addi Banks, and this is my report. We must first get on the same page. Indigenous people are defined as First Peoples, First Nations, Aboriginal peoples, and Native peoples. They are specifically recognized as the first ethnic groups in a nation. They own that space. After being colonized, invaders settled and dominated their territory as new owners who took control. These stronger ethnic groups remained in power over Indigenous people who were relegated non-citizens, displaced, and ethnically cleansed. May 12, 2022, by Praveen Menon, reported for Rutgers World, Canberra. Activists at one of the world's longest running protests for the rights of Indigenous people are not pinning their hopes for change on Australia's May 21st general election. The election campaign has been dominated by debate about rising prices, COVID-19, and climate change, with the plight of Australia's 700,000 or so Indigenous people who track near the bottom of its 25 million citizens on almost every economic and social indicator, far from the top of the agenda. Quote, I don't vote and wouldn't vote until we have our voice, said Gwenda Stanley, pictured here, an activist living at the Aboriginal Embassy camp of shelters on a lawn across from the old Parliament building in Canberra. The site was first occupied 50 years ago to protest against Australia's treatment of its Indigenous people who trace their roots back 65,000 years before British colonists arrived. While there may be cynicism about the election, Indigenous activists are taking advantage of the campaign to remind political parties of their core demand that Australia, for the first time, recognizes its original inhabitants in its constitution. The Constitution makes no reference to Indigenous people whose leaders have struggled for generations to win recognition for injustices suffered since the beginning of European colonization in the 1700s. Denied the vote until the mid-1960s, Indigenous people face a 10-year gap in life expectancy compared with other Australians and make up 30% of the prison population. Aboriginal deaths in police custody have been a problem for years, despite a royal commission looking into the issue since 1991. The government only issued a formal apology for all injustices in 2008. Campaigners are seeking a referendum, which is required to make changes to the Constitution on recognizing Indigenous minorities in the Constitution and mandating government to consult Aboriginal people on decisions that affect their lives. activists launched an information campaign last week, running on all major television networks, calling on the political parties to back a referendum in 2023. No more delays. Constitutional recognition is a complex issue in a country that only started counting its indigenous people as part of its population in 1967. But Australians are coming around in even greater numbers in support for change. Public broadcaster ABC News said last week that 73% of people agree there should be a constitutional change to give Aboriginal Australians a greater say over their lives. This was a higher account than in 2019, where voters agreed that 64%. A successful referendum would bring Australia in line with Canada, New Zealand, and the United States in formally recognizing Indigenous populations. But the big political parties are divided on how to handle the demand. Campaigning for the polls, Prime Minister Scott Morrison last week refused to back a referendum, saying instead his government's policy was to establish an Indigenous representation in the parliament through legislation. The ruling coalition had promised in 2019 to hold a referendum and allocated $160 million for the process, but little came of it. The opposition party, however, has promised a referendum, a demand first enshrined in 2017 at a convention that brought together more than 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders at the Sacred Monolith in Central Australia. Quote, 5 years after this statement was presented to the Australian people, there should be no more delay. We believe the Australian people are ready, said the Labor Department spokesperson. Begging for rights. Constitutional change required approval through a referendum, with the backing of a majority of votes in a majority of states, a rare feat achieved only 8 times in 44 attempts since 1901. But it's the only way to bring about real reform, analysts say. Quote, if we want to see true structural change that changes how our country works, then we need to have a referendum, says James Blackwell, research fellow in Indigenous diplomacy at the Australian National University. Quote, it's disappointing in many aspects that we have to keep coming back, begging for rights, begging for recognition, but it is the way our system works, Blackwell said. The activists at the Canberra camp protests are staying put as the politics plays out. Quote, that's the whole point of this embassy. Stanley says, to remind the government and the rest of the world that we are still oppressed people. And we will stay here forever. I ask, how does loving people allow this to happen? Good people who were not the original colonizers, but inherited a legacy from them. As we know, this has happened all over the world with similar results for indigenous inhabitants. Why? Entitlement. Once convinced that you are entitled to what belongs to somebody else, you justify and take their land. Then you purify your reasons to own it. This happens everywhere, check mark, absolves your particular country. But how okay are those displayed? Be they First Natives, former slaves, or victims of war, where takeover of their territory, which was part of their land, is no longer theirs. What is the fix? Aborigines of Australia say making them part of the Constitution. Australia has recognized their obligations to Indigenous populations through reparations and improvement programs. In 2015-16, the Australian government directly spent $14.7 billion on Indigenous people, of which 77% was through mainstream programs such as Medicare, Social Security payments, child care benefits, and support for university places accessed by Indigenous people. In 2021, Australia created a reparations fund of $380 million for Indigenous people forcibly removed from their families. This was months after 800 survivors filed a class action lawsuit. It is referred to as the stolen generations. Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Indigenous Australian Minister Ken Wyatt stated that this is part of a $1 billion boost to measures to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Resentment. Despite attempted repairs for ancestor abuses, Native populations worldwide are resentful. They're angry and displeased with relegations as less than the dominators in status in their own land. What we keep ignoring as humans is that getting there does not mean belonging there. You will be met by resentment when an ethnic group converges on others, be it 1792 or yesterday afternoon. But the justification that played out then is used today. Entitlement and ignoring inevitable resentments. Why? Because regardless of what you bring, Natives perceive that you take from resources more than you give to them, that they did not invite you, that you invited yourself.